Welcome to another episode here at Lightingbot. Today we have Clinton joining us from Dekogon. I guess I should have probably asked how to pronounce it, but we'll find out in a minute. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, you can ask your questions in the comments fields or wherever you're watching, be it LinkedIn, YouTube, and so on. If you have any questions you want to answer that might be complicated, I'll probably filter them and we can have them answered on the Discord in the future or something like that. But let's not waste any time. Let's welcome Clinton and let's dig deep into his history and what he's up to these days. Welcome, Clinton.
How's it going?
So, there's obviously a big difference between camera qualities here, so this makes me look a bit cheap. So in the future, I will make sure to step up the game in terms of camera. So we have Hartag watching live. Hello, Hartag. Thank you for watching. So Clinton, let's start by figuring out who you are and where you started, so people get a general idea of your journey. So, do you have any specific order of events? Let's start with what did you study and kind of how you got started and how you ended up eventually in the studio you started running.
Sure. Yeah. So I initially started. I went to a traditional college for graphic design to start out, and then after I did my 4 years there, I definitely knew I wanted to do something in art, but I wasn't really motivated when it came to just purely graphic design. I found that I liked graphic design, but it really wasn't what made me really passionate about making art. And so from there, I pushed on to go into animation, and I took another 2 years of animation to get a master's in animation. And that was in Savannah, Georgia, in the States. And then from there, I just wasn't. It took me a little while to figure out my place because I just wasn't quite sure what I liked about it yet. I did know that I liked modeling and I did know that I liked texturing. And so that kind of led me in the path to kind of explore some classes that were based in environment art production. And then from there, I was kind of like, okay, well, I'll take a few game classes and see if I like it. And I really, really liked it. I just liked how fast the turnaround was compared to like animation. Like animation, you might be working a few weeks on an animation that might render 4 seconds of animation frames, and it's kind of like feels kind of anticlimactic for how much work you put involved. And so with environments, I liked how much control I had on the scene and how quickly I could make and develop something that had a lot of story to it and had a lot of visual interest. And then so from there, I continued to school, and I did another 2 years for another master's in interactive and game design. So that was mostly just focused on shader development, art direction, kind of like look development overall.
Okay, so that's where you learn art direction, kind of like basic. And then is that one of the reasons you eventually started progressing more into art direction because you kind of liked it, or you had the confidence to do it, or?
I think what was most interesting to me is that from all those disciplines, I kind of learned that I liked perceiving the overall result and seeing the bigger picture comparatively to kind of hyper analyzing the details. I feel like oftentimes we find ourselves in one of two places where we either looking at the big picture or we're looking at like the super small details and super like refined for every little thing. And while I do I like spending some time on like texturing an asset and making it look good, or lighting a scene and making it look really great. Sometimes it's really more about what that final shot looks like or what the final scene looks like as to the bigger picture, and to not have kind of like diminishing returns on parts of the scene that maybe aren't as important for the final viewer or the player.
All right, that makes sense. Hey, Turkey Master, he's a very loyal viewer, so nice. Thank you for viewing. So I think there's another detail interesting in your history. Long before you probably started with your studios, there was a switch where you were an environment artist, then you were a freelance environment artist at 2 years, but then for 2 years you were an instructor. Was that during the same time you were doing environment artist, I believe, and you were a freelancing environment artist, and you were juggling instructor? Tell a little about that journey of deciding to be an instructor, what made you do that, and also the balance that you might have required to juggle these kind of responsibilities.
Definitely, yeah. I think in general, like I've always had an affinity to enjoy teaching others. Like I remember a lot in school when I would work with others. I liked, if I do something and something was interested in it, I'd like to like draw out a process and show kind of how I came to that deduction or that reasoning or that whatever it is that I was doing. And I found that people were fairly good and receptive to how I kind of recited that knowledge or provided that. And so I really liked education. My mother was in education. She was a teacher for a long time. And so I think I got a lot of that from her as well. But in general, like while I was in school, I was doing freelancing I think for the last 2 years I was in school. And that was just kind of get my foot in the door and just try to get in as many projects as I could. And I was kind of just taking up any like smaller freelance gigs. So, building assets or textures or helping with environments or whatever it might be. And then from there, that kind of provided me the opportunity to get my first gig, which was like a full-time studio job in Alabama. And that was for the Army Game Studio. And that was like a propaganda game. And so like it was something just to kind of get my foot in the door to try something in an actual studio for the first time comparatively to freelancing, which I think in general, I would say you learn probably the most you'll ever learn in your career in a studio or with other people because you're surrounded by people that are doing the same thing as you. And so you're constantly going to learn from them. But I found that while I like that experience, I would say, come towards now and like towards freelancing eventually, I found that as time went on, as you kind of reach that peak of what you feel like you can learn from others around you, you get to a point where you start to self-explore a lot. And so I found that as time went on, I gained less from being in the studio and gained more from having kind of, I guess, solidarity to kind of think to myself, to kind of figure out my own process at times and then communicate with other people when the time is needed. But yeah, I think it just really depends on like what kind of person you are as to like what kind of artist. Some people work much better in groups and then surrounded by others. And then some people feel like they can focus and kind of self-motivate and kind of maintain their own workflow as they kind of go on their own. But I would say regardless, I think working in a studio is extremely helpful to beginners because you need that kind of opportunity to not only explore to understand if that works for you or if that's helpful to you, but also it just kind of makes you more understanding of like, team productions. Like I think a lot of times when you go through school, when you're first learning, you're doing everything your own. So you don't really understand like, what's my place in this kind of process or how do I work with everyone else? And then as you go on, you kind of find, oh yeah, okay, I see. This is how I communicate with others. And this is the importance of being on a team and what role I play compared to like their, what they play. And also just like, it kind of teaches just general, like, I'd say like good social practice as to like how to communicate with others too, when you're like trying to work to a mutual goal kind of thing.
2 questions. How do I actually pronounce Dekogon?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Decagon. Yep. Just like that.
Dekogon. All right.
Yep.
And if you're comfortable with it, just for context, how old are you?
Oh, I'm, how am I? I'm 35, I believe, this year.
So you've done a lot for someone who's 35, obviously. Just a reminder, Clinton from Dekogon sponsored the lighting challenge we are currently having. We have extended it to the end of this month. So if you feel like last minute jump in, you can stop by Discord and you can do it for the last couple of, is it 1 week or 2 weeks that's left? So feel free to join. And yeah, thank you for sponsoring, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I was happy to. I've been watching the Discord and seeing a lot of the posts. It's been really cool so far.
Are you happy with it, considering it's one of your scenes?
Definitely, yeah. I always like when people do like something really moody because like, when you're like when you're making commercial art, sometimes you're kind of limited to a kind of not vanilla, but just more simplistic and kind of more easily accessible to most games in the direction you go for lighting and the look. And so I love when people take something really like that and make it really dramatic instead, for sure.
Yeah, these people love it, man. They're really into making it dramatic and storytelling and kind of breaking the stereotypic lighting, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one question that I get asked a lot, and I feel it might be safe to ask you, actually, is I see you've done a lot of freelancing, more or less. We're talking about a couple of years. How do you approach freelancing? If some of them who are watching now would like to do some kind of freelancing, what's your advice and learning experience as a freelancer? I think that could be interesting to learn as well.
Yeah, I would say freelancing is great because it provides you the opportunity to not only try a lot of different things, but also it's easier to get into freelancing than it is a studio job right away. And so you'll find that even a few small freelance gigs you'll suddenly learn like good process, like, like things that you don't really learn in school or when you're beginning is like, the cleanliness of your files, or like how you go about your process to make sure it's like easily understood by someone else, or like, like taking something from somebody else has started and then bringing it to completion. Like that's a lot of things that I think you're not really taught or you don't really know when you're younger. And so getting that opportunity to learn that I think is really helpful. And then also really just like having freelance experience on your LinkedIn or your resume or whatever is extremely, extremely helpful. I feel like for employers, because it shows that not only are you able to work in a team, you're able to take direction and you're able to meet deadlines. I think like artists in general, like one of the biggest downfalls of artists typically I find, and I even suffered from when I was beginning in my career, is that it's hard to like be like, okay, this is done. Like you find that kind of cutoff point very challenging to meet, because you'll be like, I'll just tweak it a little bit more. I'll tweak it a little bit more. But when you're in a production and you've done freelance work, it shows employers that you fully understand like what it takes to actually get something completed and shipped and finalized without like kind of tinkering with it forever. And so in terms of like freelancing as a gig, I would say like it's really also like valuable to you as a individual, because it not only gives you like self-worth to understand like, how much is my time worth to create something for someone else. But then also I feel like it allows you a little bit more manageability of your own individual time. So what I like about it, like right now, currently compared to when I first started, it was more about like money to survive, to live, to pay my bills and stuff like that, and like to do what I enjoyed. And now I feel like I still what I enjoy, but I find that it provides me the opportunity to have more of a fluid life compared to like a studio life. The studio life, you're in studio from whatever 8 to 6 or whatever, throughout the day, or potentially longer or whatever, depending on the hours of the studio. But I feel like with freelancing, you kind of have a bit more fluidity where, like I have a daughter and a wife. And so like at times where I'm like, oh, I want to go to the park for 2 hours, but I'll just work later tonight. I have the availability to do that. So freelancing definitely provides you a little bit more flexibility with your home life and how you go about your process. But it does take someone that's very self-managed to be able to control and figure out and to discern like, this is the way I go about doing any one task, or understanding that kind of freelance gig that you've been given.
Cool. And if you were to give 3 advice to someone starting to freelance to get, for example, clients and work, considering you probably recruit people and hire people yourself as well at this stage, and you have done freelancing, what would be the 3 key advice? Say if I wanted to, and I'm a bad example because I've done it, but someone who hasn't done it in this case, what are the 3 advices you would pass on?
I would say 1, internet presence. So like make sure your portfolio is up to date, make sure it's clear as to what skills you have and what you can do. Make sure your greatest and latest work is on there. Make sure it's enough to showcase that you are able to do tasks. Like sometimes people have too little work on their portfolios, or they don't have like specific things they're showing, but then they're offering to do that. So make sure whatever it is you're offering as a service is very visible, that you know how to do it through your portfolio and through the work that you're showing. The second, I would say, internet etiquette and email etiquette. Those are huge. I find that a lot of people are really lacking in that. And honestly, as a freelancer, it's not just the work that you make or the rate you charge. It really comes down to also like your personability and like how you engage with like clients and like new people. Because if you're emailing something and I've gotten emails at Decagon with people applying for work and they're like, got work ? And then that's their email. And I'm like, should I respond to that, or like what's to be expected from that email? What is the outcome that you expect from such an email where it's not very like clear as to, I don't know your portfolio, I don't even know your name.
Should I reply back just no?
Yeah, exactly. It's like no. It's like I don't know what to say. So like we definitely get emails like that, and we also get really long emails where it's like tells me all about them. I think really in general, like if you're a freelancer, like you kind of find the middle spot where it's like, you don't want to write a novel for them because they don't really care about your entire life story. They're just trying to find out, are you able to do the work that they're looking for, and what's your rate, and then like what's your portfolio. But you also don't want to keep it so short that you just sound abrupt and kind of direct. So like just have some etiquette as to like how you're corresponding with people, and know that like everyone's human, but we also just need details to understand at least what it is you're trying to do. Like if you're not including your portfolio link in your email, like that's a bad mistake already off the bat, because it's like I'd have to go search for you, and that's another step I have to go make to find out if you're hireable or not. And then I would say the third is just really like client etiquette in general and like client upkeep. Like you'll find that most times as a freelancer, it's not like you're not going to get like a new gig every month. It's going to be more repeat gigs over and over with same clients, or that client will refer you to someone else that needs work. And so it really is about like communication and community. And so work with other freelancers, work with clients that like, and then ask them, do they need additional help or support, or like finding ways to form that community and form those bonds that will continue on throughout the years. And don't think of a client as like, I'm just going to get this done, and if it's shitty, I don't care, because that's going to immediately damage that relationship with that client. And then that might damage, potential clients that you have access to later on, or repeat work that you'll get over your life.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So let's take a quick question, because we're kind of going back and forth in the same topic. So let's address that. What are some of the things that you learned from working in the studio compared to what you self-learned or what courses taught you? So
Sure,
I think
yeah.
he's looking for comparison. Did you learn the same things that you were taught, and so on?
Yeah, I think when you're working in a studio, you're working around, say for instance, you're at a studio, like say when I was working at Microsoft, I found that I would be working hand in hand with a lot of other disciplines. And so while I might not necessarily have that as my focus job, I would find that I would learn a lot of things that I probably wouldn't have learned otherwise at home, because I probably wouldn't have had the reason or the necessity or the urge to go and research those things as much. And so like oftentimes as an environment artist, I'd be working with lighters, I'd be working with like shader development, I'd be working with like, look dev, I'd be working with like character artists, all sorts of different things that I think really just promoted me to learn a lot more. And I feel like the level of growth you get there it goes twice as fast as any schooling I've ever gotten. So like I would say when you're in studio, you're going to learn the most you've ever learned in your career quite quickly. And I would say what self-learning provides you is it kind of provides you focus, and it also kind of provides you time to practice on your own to understand just general workflow. Like I think a lot of times when you're self-learned, you might not have that. Like in a studio, if you did something or you're doing something and you see someone else doing it, you would kind of understand, okay, how long did it take them to do the same thing? And then how did they go about that process compared to how I went about my process? And you kind of check yourself against those other people on your team just to figure out the process if you're doing it the most efficient and correct way. While at home, you have more time to explore things that maybe you're a bit more out of the box. So like if I'm trying to do something and I'm like, oh, I've never done it this way in ZBrush, let me try that or give that an attempt. Or you might discover somebody's doing something really strange online, a certain process, and you're like, oh, let me attempt to do that as well. It just gives you a little bit more self-focused and I guess just like time to really hone in on things that you maybe more interest to you than more of interest to the project. Because when you're in studio, you're always going to be focused on the project. When you're at home, you're going to have more time to kind of pick and choose what things that are the most interesting to you overall.
All right, that's cool. So, guys, so far we covered a little bit about freelancing, because I know you guys have been asking for it for a while. We might cover more in the future in more detail. You guys were asking specifically about the journeys and stuff. There was another thing as well. This the fact that you have been, I think you've done. What's it called? Pluralsight. You've done think tank training as mentor, at least. You've done CG Spectrum, Epic Games, educational content creator, CGM instructor, and they are all kind of interconnected in different time and space. Your average gap is like 1.5 years, 2 years before you take a break and you start teaching again, I noticed. So the whole teaching concept, if someone wanted to get into that area to be an instructor, either do something on their own or work for someone else, how does that work, and what are your advices in that front?
Sure, yeah. If you find that you like enjoy teaching, or you feel that you're good at documentation, or you feel like you're good at like maybe you're a good like YouTuber or like Instagrammer or whatever, and you just like to record yourself and you're good at that process and explaining something to somebody through any kind of platform, I think it really just there's so many ways to deliver that content nowadays that it's really in whichever way you feel you excel the most. And I think in general, like if you're interested in teaching specifically, I would start by trying to create some of your own content. And there's a lot of ways to release that. Gumroad, QBrush, I'd say ArtStation. You can sell that content. However, there's a lot of artists that I've learned from, that I've downloaded their informational videos, and I've watched through them and really enjoyed them. And it was just direct sell. Like, it wasn't like an online class or anything they did. They just had it. They made it their content themselves. But doing that will kind of provide you the first experience to kind of understanding how to teach, and also how to organize your content. Because a lot of really the most time consuming thing about teaching is like organizing the way in which you provide context to a process. And so in general, I find that that's always the most challenging thing for people up front, because somebody might say, oh, I'm good at something, but it's a totally different story to then turn around and kind of be able to go tell someone how you did it. Because you find that a lot of it becomes muscle memory and just kind of like how you think about it while you're doing it. And so to then be able to provide that information back to someone else can be quite a challenge into itself. So definitely practicing that and just kind of seeing how you can organize your own content to something that you could provide. And then beyond that, then, using that content that you've made to potentially interview or apply at schools that you maybe want to teach at, and see if they have openings and things like that. I do find that there's quite a lot of schools and online educational resources that are definitely providing a lot more opportunities for artists to kind of do that kind of teaching process. And whether it depends on pre-recorded content or continuous classes. Like I know Decagon, we just did the like a big learning series on ArtStation in a partnership with them. And that was super fun to do. And we had a lot of really cool content coming out with that. We have some more coming out this year as well, too, in a similar kind of vein. So that should be really fun. But those artists that are doing that, those are people that Decagon has worked with in the past, or has known, like we've known those artists to be really good at like their process. And so we've gotten them to come in and kind of give that information through the learning series. And so just because, I guess, showing that prowessness and that ability really kind of makes it so that they're easily hireable, because it's like, if I can see that they understand that skill set, then sure, like they'd be a great professor or teacher for any kind of school or, online learning series.
Yeah, it's true. It is quite demanding to teach. Even make courses takes time. But it's a good way to double check that if you actually are understanding something and kind of explain it. I totally agree. Hey guys, there's like quite a few of you watching across the different streaming platforms. How about leaving a like, a comment, and subscription? That would be greatly appreciated for the algorithm in the social media, so people can stop by while we're streaming as well. That's always fun. So you've been an instructor, you're quite busy. So are you still doing CGMA, I believe, still,
Yeah,
right?
so I've been teaching CGMA for 4 or 5 years now. And I just, this year, coming in a couple of days, will be the first course I'm offering, an intro to Unreal 5. And that will be focused on everything from environment art, nanite content creation, lumen, lighting, all that kind of stuff. So basically, just understanding Unreal 5 for those that are, either brand new learners to Unreal, or maybe they've learned Unreal a little bit in the past with Unreal 4 and they want to come into 5 knowing it a little bit better. And then I also teach an modularity course. And that's like a 10-week course compared to the 6-week intro course. And the 10-week course is basically like creating an environment from start to finish. And that includes lighting, environment construction, modularity, understanding the overall mood and tempo and theme, all that kind of stuff together. And so that one's a really fun class. But they run every quarter with CGMA, and so you could definitely check those out. And it's like, I think it's a 30-person limit per class. So if you don't get in the class right away, you can apply for the following quarter to get in that.
Yes, it's cgmamasteracademy.com, I believe.
Yep, that's correct.
Yep. Look up Clinton if you guys want to learn from someone who's done a lot. Doesn't hurt with some side cash. So yeah, that's good. So let's see what's some other our loyal questioner. What is the difference between an environment artist and, say, a hard surface artist, or a hero asset modeler, or prop modeler? What roles would be responsible for what?
Sure. Yeah, so it really depends. Like, every studio is going to be different. The bigger the studio, the more specialized the skill or the trait or the ability in what you're doing day to day. And then the smaller the studio, typically there's less people. And so more of those people in that studio have to do various tasks depending on what's needed. And so you'll find that, say, the Bethesdas or the Microsofts or the Ubisofts, all those kind of studios will have very specialized people. They'll have people that literally just do trees all day or literally just do rocks all day. And so that skill set is based on what the need is and what the project is. So a general environment artist can do anything from they typically are more of a jack of all trades when it comes to all the skill sets they have. They don't really do too much lighting per se, but it's typically more scene development or construction, asset creation, texture creation, things like that. But say, for instance, if you're a hard surface artist. So we had like a hard surface team at Microsoft on Gears of War, and they worked on like robots and tanks and vehicles and guns and things like that. And their specific task was just to focus on those because those were such specific iconic parts of the Gears of War series. And so because of that, it required a lot more attention than, say, for instance, someone just sitting down and like knocking out a gun in a few days. It would require, weeks to months to develop something that looked quite good and was really polished, because that's really what makes that game so iconic overall. And then when it comes to hero asset modeling or prop modeler, it really just depends. Like a hero asset is just basically a more dedicated and I would say refined asset or prop. And so it's, say, for instance, you had a giant statue in the middle of town. That would be something more of a hero asset compared to a prop. And because you kind of classify the two as a prop is something more commonly seen that could be duplicated and pushed throughout the scene multiple times. And it's supposed to be a bit more ambiguous and not super descript, so that if you see that box in the corner, you're not going to say, I'm pretty sure I've seen that box exactly before. It's supposed to be a little bit more less visible that it's being used over and over. And then a hero asset is going to be something that it's very iconic or very specific to the location or the game or the type of environment you're in, to really showcase, as a landmark or potentially something just that it's only used maybe once or potentially twice in the game, kind of thing. And then what would be responsible for? What roles? It really, like I said, it really just depends on the studio. So like when I was working at Bethesda, I would be doing textures, meshes, and then a level layout. And then when I was working at Microsoft, I was working as an environment artist. I was working on mostly assets. And then those assets would go to a level designer or a level artist, and they would place those in the scene. And then when I changed roles at Microsoft to a look dev artist, I was working with like character artists for like shader for hair and for skin. And I was working with tech team on like helping them with like landscape stuff and things like that, and just trying to figure out what the general look of the game is going to be. So it really just depends on the studio overall. And then some of the smaller studios I've worked on everything from lighting to level layout to block out to design, really just anything that was needed, because the smaller the studio, the more requirement it is for people to kind of have a fuller understanding of the whole process.
This interview is great, isn't it, guys? Make sure you leave a like, positive comments to Clinton. It's definitely good stuff he's coming up with, and it's such a good variety. Normally, I would need 3-4 different people to cover this kind of stuff. So, you guys are lucky. We're all lucky. Let's just get rid of this. So, I have another question for you. Is that board games behind you in the shelf?
Yeah, it's a wall of board games. Me and my wife play a lot of board games for sure.
So, which board game is your favorite that you would recommend someone to pick up?
We have a lot. Recently, we've been playing a lot of Wingspan. If you've ever played that one, it's like it's a really good game. It's a bird game, and it's like, it sounds really weird. And when I was first showing it, I was like, this is really strange, but we've probably played it 100 times now. It's a really fun game.
Yeah, I have played it, but I played it in French when I was living in France working in Ubisoft, because I had to like sit there and go figure out what it was saying, and poor people, they have to be so patient. Something that would have been finished like probably an hour or two ago, I'm like super nervous. So yeah, that's definitely fun.
But at least there's pictures on all the cards, so it makes it a little
easier. It made it a bit easier. I think that's why they picked the game as well. That okay, he'll have an easier time if we do this. So let's do 2 more questions, and then we should still have time to cover a little bit about the studio, the processes there, because you are clearly articulate, so you're able to go through a lot. So Adam has a question,
Sure.
and thank you for watching, Adam, and thank you for asking questions for you as well. How do you find time to develop your skills? Do you do this by selecting projects that suits you, or maybe you're just taking a few weeks break and learning something new?
Sure. Yeah. I think it really depends on like where I'm at in my career. Like I definitely, there's times when you're at a studio and you're working and there's not a lot of time because you're either, doing a lot of overtime or crunching or doing this and that. So obviously those are the most like viable times for kind of learning something new. But when I am in more of a downtimes or the lulls, I do find that at home, I'll try to work on something that's kind of completely different than what I'm working on in studio. So I found that when I was working on like kind of like whimsical stuff, I was kind of doing more dark stuff at home or like vice versa, or just kind of finding ways to kind of diversify my skill set. So like if I felt like I hadn't touched ZBrush in a while, I would like find ways to do it at home. So I would just like get a little practice in just so I didn't get kind of rusty. Because I find that if you do something, a skill, and you only do it once and you kind of lay it to the side and you kind of forget about it for a while, you tend to kind of fade off as to like your skill set or your memory about how you went about that process. And so it's good to kind of remind yourself, even just for like a few quick practices, to like be like, okay, what it was that I was doing, how do I go about that process again? And like maybe there's something I can just kind of create that is interesting to me. And then in general, like I work more as, if I would say, between like a traditional and a commercial artist, I tend to lean towards commercial because that's just kind of how I built my career, and just like working to make sure I can pay my bills or whatever. And so when I'm making something, I'm always thinking like is what I'm creating commercially viable? Is it commercially viable as an option? Like, could I make something that I'm really passionate about, and then could I find ways to resell that or provide that on a marketplace somewhere so that someone can use this in a game? And so that's kind of part of the reason and the kind of logic behind how Decagon kind of took off from the beginning. But yeah, I think overall, just like
we're gonna get to that
yeah,
question actually eventually.
sure. So yeah, and then
Yeah.
in general, like finding like projects, I think it's really just about what interests you, like what you find, visually interesting. I keep a Pinterest board of like a bunch of things that I just like, oh, I saw this one thing and I really liked it. And I'll kind of save it on a private board to be like, maybe I'll reflect back on that later. Maybe I'll just look at it again and say that looks good. But either way, it's something that I can kind of come back to and kind of stimulate my mind on things that I really could be passionate about if I were to make a scene or environment or a piece from. And then when you're trying to learn something new, I find that as you get older, it definitely gets harder to find that time and also take that kind of effort, because you have to break old habits. And so I think trying to avoid that kind of old person fatigue as you kind of go in your career forward, like really try to remember like how you feel when you felt when you're young, when you're really passionate about learning, and try to continue that same momentum throughout your career, because it'll definitely help you and it'll definitely keep you in kind of front of the pack when it comes to like, new things that are coming out, new technologies, because there's always going to be something new. Like whatever you're doing this year, that process will obviously change in a few years. Like, like in 5-6 years, we probably won't even be baking neural maps like anymore for like AAA development. So I think all that stuff's just really, really, it's important to be aware of those things as you're kind of moving forward, to just kind of always have an open mind about like learning something new and trying to do that for yourself.
I'm older than you, so I can tell you the old fatigue is gonna kick in more.
Yeah, it definitely sets in.
So that's a good question. Thank you, Adam. There's another one from him. By developing your skills, there are more often artistic skills, or maybe you're trying to improve other skills now.
Yeah, I
It's a
think in
difficult
general,
question.
yeah, I think overall
sense.
your skills, like I think it's more about like, okay, so when you start out, you kind of start in a main vein as to like learning the skill set and what your specialty is. But I think as you continue on, you'll start to see things along the road as you're driving that you're like, oh, that'd be interesting to explore. That'd be interesting to explore. And I think another thing, as you get older, you will find that you've kind of reached a maximum to what you can expect to understand when it comes to your main medium. But as you get older, you'll find more time to explore those kind of side roads. So like, like I would say I was a pretty shit lighter when I started out. And so like, as I've had more time to explore that, I've had more opportunities to test that skill and to learn more about it. And the same thing goes for like shaders and like, like anything like animation, anything that you're like not quite doing when you first start out, like just finding that time and the avenues to like explore that further if it's of interest. But all those things always lead back to being helpful to the main kind of vein of your overall task. Because I find that, say for instance, I went and did that graphic design for 4 years, and sometimes I think back and I'm like, it wasn't a waste because I use graphic design almost every day in some kind of environment thing I'm doing. And so even though it wasn't my main attraction as to like what my process was, it's super viable to helping me understand art forms in general. So it's like all those things collectively help to add to your overall skill set.
Yep, I definitely agree with that as well. It's definitely good to have a holistic approach to a lot of things to really, I wouldn't say necessarily stand out, but it definitely gives you an advantage in your mindset and thought process on how you approach things. Guys, didn't you guys notice I put in some background for you guys? There is a Zelda, there's God of War, and then there is a Street Fighter in the background. So now we get to the main project, the main questions when it comes to your studio. So let's talk a little bit how did you get started. I did research, I did go through your library, because you actually you can kind of track your first assets and all those kind of stuff. So for the public who probably didn't do it, how did you get started? Why did you get started? How would someone else do the similar things?
Yeah, so I think where it kind of started initially where I was working at a studio, and there was times where we would have applicants and people that I would know that would apply, or artists that I knew were applying, and their skill set was really awesome. But due to a lot of studios have specific things where they want people to be in studio, and so they can't, they don't have either the funding or the ability or the legal issues to fly them there, to get them set up, to get them visas, everything else. There's just a lot of red tape, and so I think what kind of inspired me to build Decagon was more of like an international approach to art itself. So there were so many good artists that I was like, why are we so restricted on this? Like if everyone could be remote and work freelance from home, then why can't there be a studio essentially of freelancers contributing to projects that we're working on? So that kind of promoted the initial projects where we just worked primarily on marketplace content. And then that went so well, and so many of those freelancers just were so dependable and such great artists and really great to work with, that it kind of built into us starting to take contracts, and then from those contracts it led to other contracts, and then bigger contracts, and then bigger studios, and then so on and so forth. And then to today, we're working with like all different studios. We're working on learning content. We're working on marketplace content. It's kind of just like all over the place. And what I like is that there's just like an international community, and there's no bias based on where you live. It's just like, or your social economic status or anything like that. It's just basically like, if you're able to produce the content and work with us and in doing that, then it's like, then we're happy to work with those people if they're good artists as well.
Okay, so if someone were to apply to you tonight as we talk, they're writing an application, what's your advice to make it easy for them? Except what we talked about earlier, not just send an email and leave it kind of empty.
Sure. Yeah, I think in general, like it's really about a few things. So when I'm observing someone's portfolio, I'm looking at their skill set overall. So I'm looking to make sure they understand the overall process. I'm looking to know they know good PBR. If they're baking their assets, it's really good baked quality. If they have any engine work, they're integrating their stuff in properly. I would say like overall, just a really good attention to detail. I've hired artists that have 2 props in their portfolio, but those 2 props were outstanding. Like there's so much character to them. Like every little part was kind of like tailored, roughness, normal, all that kind of stuff is just really, really good attention to detail. There's no visible render errors, things like that. And so really just making sure that whatever it is you're showing is like really your best foot, because I think something I tell my students a lot is that your portfolio represents like 100% capacity of what you make. And when you're working for an employer, most likely the most you're ever going to get to that employer is about 80%. And the reason why is because you just don't have infinite time like you do on a portfolio. portfolio, I can work on a portfolio piece till I die. Like, it doesn't matter. But when you're working for an employer, you obviously have a limited amount of time until the work has to get done and it has to be shipped. So you always have to make kind of cuts and sacrifices when it comes to quality, when it comes to any kind of commercial work. So because of that, I'm looking at your portfolio expecting if that's your 100%, I'm expecting 80% would do really well for what we work for on our projects. And so it should be like just the most polished kind of asset that you could kind of possibly put on your portfolio. And then also just like really clean and like, I think really clean portfolio. Like if you have a bunch of spelling errors in your work, or your description is like really funky and it's got a bunch of spelling errors, or like, your about or your email, what that tells me is that you're not really an attention detailed oriented person. And that means that when you're submitting files, it's probably also going to be very messy. And those are kind of hard people to work with, because as a remote studio, we're kind of relying on everyone to pull their fair share and really be, clean in their process, and like very, I think overall, like very self-driven to make sure that, we're working with you to make the processes simple for you. And then you should be working with us to make the processes simple for us, so that everyone goes happy and paid and gets to make our awesome artwork together. And so I think those are the biggest things that for sure I focus on.
So I have a friend, and he struggles a little bit to find work. I've worked with him like on some other assets and stuff personally, but and he's really good at stylus and cartoon stuff. But in his case, and he's very good at details too. But the problem is when he writes stuff, his first language is in English, so he's maybe hard to understand it either verbally or written. I think it was one or the other. How do you deal with that pre-assumption or
yeah, of course. I assume because we're an international studio, not everyone, not ESL. Like I understand that English will be potentially a second language, or maybe you're learning it as you go, and that's fine. We have lots of artists that don't even really speak full English, and that's fine. I think it's really about like if you're taking the attention and care to communicate with a studio that is American, which is Decagon, then I think just take the time to like reach out to fellow artists. Like there's so many Discord channels, and there's so many other artists that are out there that I'm sure you're working with or talking with, and just say, hey, can you do me a favor and can you just proofread this really quick and tell me what you think? Think I need to clean anything up, or do you think I could write this better? Because just like you're saying, he's your friend. I'm sure more than likely he could probably reach out to you and say, hey, can you just take a quick look at this to make sure I'm spelling things right and this makes sense and there's no grammatical errors? And then you doing that, is promoting again, that goes back to the whole community thing. When you have a good community as a freelancer, it makes your life a whole lot easier. When you're communicating with other artists from your own country and then other artists, overseas, it just makes it a lot easier when you're going for those jobs and you just need a little bit of a check for sure. But yeah, I think in general, like most of Decagon is run, I would say primarily on a visual basis. Like there's very little communication that needs to take place except for small like feedbacks. And those are just pretty easy to understand. We keep them kind of concise. And so you don't necessarily have to have perfect English skills to work here. I would say most international studios when it comes to like work like that for freelance. But it's just really about like taking the extra time and due diligence to really just make sure that if you are communicating with somebody, you try your best to make sure it's very clearly understood as to what message you're trying to convey at least.
Cool. So we have a little bit over 15 minutes left. If anyone want to ask some questions, now would be a good time to start listing them up. But Clinton, are you ready to be grilled on your own art?
Sure.
All right. There is a share button below that should have a plus sign on the screen. If you click it and select the screen, we should be able to have a look at your work and start with the more visual development talk.
All right, let's see. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let me know when you guys can see, okay?
Thanks, Thomas. You get a big respect from Thomas. He's a fan of the studio and your work. That's good.
Oh, thank you, Thomas.
All right, adding this to the stream. That should be good.
Cool. So yeah, so this is my portfolio, and I use ArtStation's kind of format for like their online web portfolio kind of setup. I used to do my own custom, and I found that I've had this question asked a lot by students, and they're like, "Oh, I do my own custom website, or why should I do ArtStation?" And really, the honest answer is ArtStation is best only for the fact that people are comfortable and they understand the UI and the process of using ArtStation. And so, you'll find that employers, including myself, get kind of turned off when they don't really know where to navigate to find your work and your content. And so using a platform like ArtStation, I find is a bit more productive and does provide, I think, better results for most kind of interviewing students that I've worked with that eventually do find jobs because they switched over. They had good work, but they didn't have it presented very well. So either ArtStation or like an ArtStation website thing. So I guess some of the more recent stuff we worked on that I worked on the lighting as well for was kind of we do a lot of marketplace content, and so here's a few scenes from some of that content, and really most of this is still from Unreal 4. We do have a few Unreal 5 stuff projects going on, which I highly suggest to people that are trying to learn lighting now to definitely get more into Unreal 5, because you'll find that there's a lot more skills that are important to learn there and a lot of new tech that's really important that I think is going to change a lot of workflows. So I think it's important to start to learn that if possible.
Fine, if you say so, I'll do it.
But yeah, so some of the scenes in Decagon, I like. Some of the scenes we hire outside artists. Some of the scenes, it really just depends on what it is the project is and like what role I'm taking in it, or how many people we have on it or whatnot. Another artist that we work with that's a lighter, Carl Shed. If you haven't looked him up, he's like honestly probably my favorite all-time artist of all time. He's just great, and so check out Carl's work if you haven't gotten a chance. But he's got some awesome stuff on there on his portfolio you could check out as well too. But he's got some really good things to look at as a lighter, like to see. He sells mood like no other person I've ever met. Like basically, if you're looking for like a horror aesthetic or anything like that, he just has some awesome work. But yeah, so this one I lit, and we have a few other here. So yeah, so like some of these, like I said, a lot of these are more tailored towards more of a generic lighting approach, only because the client, I want the client to be able to use this in whatever capacity that they best feel works for them. And so have a bit more of a kind of vanilla feel to the scene, but still feel realistic is important for a lot of these marketplace scenes, just to ensure they have a firm understanding of like kind of how they can use this, and then potentially maybe alter this or edit this to fit whatever their needs are. And then, yeah, so like this was one of my scenes that I did personally. I worked with a few other people at Decagon for a few of the assets and textures on this, but overall, I worked on the majority of this scene, and this was just kind of a passion project that I'd had for some time. Overall, it was the lighting is meant to feel more, I would say, like a painting, like a Renaissance painting, than like a really kind of contrasty modern day film. And so you see a lot of like Baroque paintings and things like that where they really avoid like dark blacks or heavy whites. And it's more of a kind of middle gray kind of feel to it because of how they painted it or the kind of composition, what they created. And so a lot of this scene is kind of set to look like that.
So do you have like extra lights to like fill in some shapes, or is it just one directional light you're using?
Yeah, so this one actually has a few. So let me, this one is a one directional light, a skylight that's a custom texture. And then there's a few fill lights that I placed inside underneath the awning here and underneath of the in the little porch here. And that's to kind of help with fill, because all the lights in this scene are movable. And so because of that, I had to kind of keep two things in mind. One is performance. So I can't have but so many overlapping movable lights. But two, I didn't want to sacrifice the quality of the bounce light because of the restrictions of the directional light. And so doing that kind of helped to give it a little bit more boost underneath those areas. I also used the, screen space AO, which is like a beta function in UE4. You can turn that on in the render settings. And I find that actually helps a lot with the shadow and kind of the feel of how things feel grounded. And then another thing that I learned from Carl that was really helpful, because Carl kind of gave me some feedback as we were going along. Another reason why I mentioned Carl. He's a really good artist. And
yeah, for sure. I have seen some of his work, but I've never asked him. I might ask him if he wants to come on in the future.
Yeah, he's great. Carl's awesome. And he's a really personable, awesome guy as well, too. So
I'll just say that Clinton said that you would say yes.
Yeah. But yeah, he's given me a ton of help, especially like in my kind of, like I said, I was environment first, and then I've been learning lighting as I've kind of been going along over the last few years, and he's been super critical in that kind of regard. But one thing he kind of showed me was some kind of tips on like my movable light. I reduced the amount of shadow cascades to 2, and that kind of softens the shadow a bit. And so you want to find a kind of place between like 2 and 4. A lot of people will just think like, I'm just going to crank it to 6 and get really harsh shadows. And while that does sometimes look better, depending on the type of mood you're going for, because I was going for more of an overcast vibe, I didn't want a lot of direct lighting to kind of make it feel like there was a direct sun when obviously the clouds would probably block most of the sun coming into the space, and it would diffuse a lot of the lighting. And so because of that, I used a setting of 2 cascades, and that kind of helped to kind of blur out the shadows a little bit, but also still feel like there is some kind of directional. Like I didn't want it to feel omnidirectional. Like I feel like a game that's really good at doing omnidirectional lighting is like, say, Last of Us 2. There are a lot of scenes where it's like there is a sign of directional light, but at times when you're outside, it almost feels like just more of an overcast kind of haze to it, but it still feels believable. And so that's a really, really challenging, hard look to pull off. And so I find that whenever possible, I try to have at least some semblance of a directional, or it kind of gets lost a little bit sometimes.
So an overcast lighting would probably recommend or challenge some of the lighting artists to try that out to kind of show that they can do something that's difficult.
Definitely. And you'll find that it's a very thin line between feeling like everything's just kind of like a gray haze of fog and like a really like a directional, like I would say like an overcast light. So like if you look at anything like Last of Us 2, you'll see a lot of the shots look so good because they have this kind of fill or this like omnidirectional haze to it. And so shots like this, you can see like there's still like a feeling of direction because you can see on top of the truck and things like that in the car over here. But overall, the lighting is fairly like unremarkably directional by any means. It's mostly omnidirectional. And so being able to get that look is extremely challenging. Again, another thing that I think Carl is really good at. So like definitely look to some of his work if you're trying to go for that look, because you'll see if you're able to get that look, it's very filmatic. It's very cinematic overall. Like it looks great. It's very hard to get.
All right.
Yeah, and then the same scene, I just took another pass at lighting it again to give it a different mood and aesthetic. And so like things like this, where I wanted to cast lighting out of the windows, I would use an additional light to kind of echo the effect of the lighting coming from the window. And the same goes for the other windows and the fire lights and stuff like that too. And just depending, sometimes if the shot called for it, sometimes I'd put a fill light or a point light in with a very with no specular response, so that way you get a bit more fill to the scene. I think sometimes artists will make the mistake of like being like, oh, I want something moody, but then they get something really black and it just feels like it's hard to see. To the point where it's like it's nothing really worth seeing because you're looking for a portfolio of a bunch of black photos. And so really just be aware, like, check your levels in your histogram in Photoshop or wherever else you're checking your information for your final render, and see like how dark really is the scene, like where do the things fall, because even a dark photo or shot should still have some form of histogram, I would say, range, so that you get some kind of visual definition between what you want the player to see or the viewer to see and what you don't want them to see.
I told you guys. Now you can listen to Clinton instead.
Yeah, let's see.
That's a nice shot. The last one, I quite like that one.
Yeah, that one was fun to work on for sure. Yeah, I think like this is one of those ones where it's starting to get into that kind of omnidirectional space where it's like there are focuses throughout the scene, but overall the grass and stuff
has a Diablo vibe to it, actually.
Yeah, totally right. Yeah, I can see that.
Very good. So during this process, because you said you were not as good as you are now in your lighting, what would you say is top 3 challenges that you had to overcome?
I would say, like, in general, understanding the engine, because like no tool for lighting is the same. Like you can be a good lighter in Maya or Max or Blender or whatever, and then you get into Unreal and it's like there might be similar terminology, but there's still going to be some differences of the way you go about your process, because there's a big difference between like an offline and an online render, like a real time and a pre-rendered kind of shot. With a pre-rendered shot, you have so many things, bells and whistles, tricks, levers and switches you can turn on to help with the lighting and the final look and the ray tracing and all sorts of other stuff. But there are more limitations, especially for real-time lighting, especially for shipping products. Like there's a lot of cool features in Unreal that you can turn on, but I think knowing what features are realistically usable for most users and players for like a shipping game is very different than what features are just cool for a portfolio shot. So understanding the kind of differences between those two and just kind of like working to understand the tools and what is available for you to kind of use and understanding that performance impact as well. And then I think the other thing that was really kind of hard for me to get at first was understanding when and how to use colored lighting. Because sometimes you get to a point where you're like, oh, I want this to be really pink in here, but maybe it's not the pink in the light. Maybe it's the pink from the post process, or maybe it's the pink from the wall behind it. Maybe it's pink bounce light. I think just being really aware and attentive to like where your colors are coming from and when and how to use, light in your actual or colors in your actual lighting to make that definition or decision. I think more subtlety with lighting is typically the better when it comes to colors, but I think there are quite a lot of like powerful ways you can push the color and lighting to really promote an emotional response. Like I just watched like Blade Runner the other night with my wife, and I just kept thinking to myself, I was like, damn, some of the colors in here are so wacky, but I just love how good it looks because like they really push the palette. But I think it's important to keep in mind, it's not just the lighting in those shots. It's also like the composition as a whole. So that's a lot of post-process as well too. So finding the balance of how those lights can also cooperate with the post-process and getting that final look is really important.
I think for the Blade Runner example, it's because they're within the same color. Technically, it's just the values that are different, and I think you learn that a lot when you do painting. Because I started learning painting a few months ago, and I've noticed that they are really very specific on those using one color, but controlling the values. So that's definitely a good thing. I think if someone wants to understand it, my recommendation is definitely to pick a painting for that. It really helps. So you have one picture that's called Kings something. Kings has a neon lights or something.
Oh yeah, King Wash. Yeah. Let's see. That's right here.
So it also stands out a little bit for some of your lighting as well. So when you make these decisions, because I see a pattern in terms of color palette and post processing, is there a specific thought process when you make these decisions? Is there a specific mood you're trying to do, and how do you make that decision, that process? Because it can be a chaotic journey for a lot of people.
Oh,
The
definitely.
minute they have to make that decision, they get confused. They don't know where to look. They don't know what reference to pick. They don't. It really is a lot, and they just don't do it because it's just too much. So.
Definitely. I think that there's a few things that I think when I'm working on a scene, like I would say it's about half split for what comes organically and what comes from what my desire is. So I tend to like to work in a manner that allows things to kind of come together a bit more organically at times to let it influence not only what I want, but just how it feels as it's coming together. I know it's kind of a hard thing to just like randomly describe to somebody, but like you'll find that when you're making any scene that you start to get an idea of what the tone that you're providing is to the viewer, and then you'll figure out what it is that you want to emphasize more from that. So I think a lot of it's what I find a lot of things that I'm influenced by are like I'd say the most probably direct is like the Nolan Batman films. Like I really like a lot of the color palettes in those, and like just the shots themselves like are really really striking to me. And I just really liked always like this kind of this muted teal that they would use a lot in the film. And so those kind of things definitely spoke to me, especially during this era when I was like working on this project overall. And so a lot of times what I would do is I would take a shot that I really liked. And if there was, particular colors in there I wanted to grab, I'd take that into Photoshop and I'd blur the photo into a point where it kind of came into like a mass of like maybe 6 to 7 colors that were kind of left in the palette. And then I would kind of color sample from those to kind of determine what my overall range was going to be as to what I was trying to get for my final result. And then in general, when I was lighting this scene, I was thinking more about painting with lighting. And so I found that sometimes when you light something very realistically, because this is obviously not extreme realism, it's a bit more hyper real or exaggerated realism. because when you're doing something realistically, you'll find that lighting has a tendency to typically diffuse very quickly, or make the scene feel a bit more monotone with a realistic light, or how a light falls off. And so being really aware of like directional, or I guess more spotlight, like the penumbra of that, and like the, the focus of that, helps to kind of allow you to kind of paint with light. So you can kind of choose specific areas of your scene that you want to specifically draw the eye to, and then also allow resting spaces between each, without letting any one space fall into full darkness. Because remember, like, we don't want any blacks, but we also don't want it to be so boring that you're kind of like, it's just kind of everything's visible. You kind of want to leave a bit of mystery to the eye. Like, as you're exploring the space and kind of going from light source to light source throughout the image, you're kind of looking to each space and observing it, and then kind of moving to the next. Whereas if you were to light it very diffused, you kind of get the whole thing at once. And so you kind of want to play with the visual for the player or the viewer, so they can kind of experience the whole image as a piece at a time, essentially, I would say.
Okay. So how often do you use post-processing to alter contrast, mood, color, or do you try and achieve it with the lighting first?
No way, 100% of the time. Like I said, I'm not a professional lighter by any means, for like a AAA studio or like a film quality lighter. And so like, there's definitely tricks that I have to also lean into for my own understanding, right? Like, everyone's going to have that level of skill set in which they understand how things work together. I definitely know lighters that are really proficient in like the lighting aspect, where they can basically be like, I need very little post-process to achieve what I want. But I also find that I really like the level of control that I get with post-process. And oftentimes it provides me a bit more artistic influence than it does if I were to just purely rely on the lighting itself. And then also it's like any artist, right? Like, you're very seldom are you just going to like ship a product out and be like, no edits, no nothing, like, here it is. Like, no film's going to do that. Like, that's impossible. You look at almost any modern film in Hollywood, and it's going to have some kind of post-process, even if it's a little bit. And so I think it's just really okay to lean into that as a useful tool if you find that promotes the mood or the look you're after. But I think you can't post-process your way out of bad lighting. So it's really about like building good lighting, or at least decent lighting, to the point where you can have something to control through your post-process, and then using that post-process to kind of finish the last 10 or 15% of the project to kind of get it where you want it visually.
All right. So our hour is actually up. So last question, which is a personal question, really,
Sure.
and completely not related to lighting. But I've been trying to submit something to the marketplace for Epic Games. They have turned it down twice. The first time it was needed 10 assets because I didn't have enough 10 unique assets. The second time, someone else reviewed it probably, and they said it looks a bit stylized now, so now you need 50 assets. So I was like, damn, that's a lot. So is that like a common practice with Epic Games, that there's different reviewers and they have different perception? And if so, do you have any advice for me when it comes to making it look more realistic when it's kind of realistic already?
I mean, I can't speak for Epic, obviously, but like, it really depends on, I guess they have pretty fairly laid out guidelines, but I do think, those guidelines get updated every year to like what they're looking for in particular. I think the limit is 15 assets for most content packs or whatnot. But I think in general, like, whenever you're submitting something, I think the biggest thing they're looking for is that, does it provide viable use for the end user? And I think if it's something that's like, is the submission like messy at all? Is it cleanly laid out, and does it make sense? Would someone find use in this? Like, are the textures cleanly laid out? Did you just do a bunch of like reskins? Like, they don't allow any reskinning. That's something they definitely don't allow. Things like that. It's just really just being aware. Like, think about it as a reviewer. Like, I always think when I submit, like, we probably get like maybe 95% of our submissions through without any issues, but then there's always 5% that'll come back and be like, you need to fix this error or this issue. And so honestly, it's helpful, because at the end of the day, when it goes to the marketplace, you're going to have people feedback on your assets. And so it's almost nice to have that check in between before you get to the marketplace, because then those users are going to have the exact same issues, if not more issues, that they're going to complain about. So having that check to make sure that it's actually is a viable tool or is viable use to another user. So I think just like think like a reviewer. Like think like, would you want this on your store, and what use does it provide? And then like, is it cleanly usable? Like, does it provide an obvious use as to how I'd go about injecting this into my game or this project? But I would definitely say stylized is a bit harder because there's a lot less use for it. So I think like maybe I'm not sure on we don't really have any stylized content with Decagon, so I've never really gone through like the approach of trying to get approved for anything that's stylized. So it could be the lighting, it could be the texturing overall. It could be checking the PBR values to make sure that they're all kind of in alignment with a realistic kind of scale. Maybe the proportions are a bit strange. Like things like that to check are really important if you're aiming for a realistic approach.
Cool. Well,
yeah, hopefully that helps for sure.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I always have no idea, so that's why I'm asking. It's a learning process, everything. So thank you so much for showing up, and thank you so much for sharing your experience and knowledge. It is greatly appreciated. And hopefully we can do it again, because there's quite a lot that we didn't cover, mostly because it's an hour and people tend to drop off around 40 minutes and come back for the replays afterwards instead. Is there any lasting words you want to say, market, mention?
No, I just think like, few things, I guess. Like I said, check out Carl's work. He's definitely a great artist. I'd say like, if you're interested in applying, feel free to apply through the Decagon website or directly to my email, which is on the website. And I would say the lighting challenge is looking awesome. So if you're in that, definitely keep pushing your work, and keep posting. I think it's looking really good so far. And so I'm really excited to see what the final results are for that.
Cool. Thank you so much for your support, and hopefully we can keep collaborating and stuff.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. You guys were too slow with the questions. Sorry. I guess you guys can contact Clinton directly if you have any more questions regarding the studio. Maybe someone's gonna apply, who knows. But thank you for your time. And what we're gonna do a quick wave while I slowly move my mouse to end broadcast, so we maybe can do some like after talk. So goodbye everyone, thank you for watching. Have a nice day.